Okay, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Acting for Biodiversity at the Landscape Level, which is a webinar to present and discuss ways of managing, restoring, and conserving biodiversity at the landscape level, and especially with a focus on national biodiversity strategy and action planning. My name is Andre Mada from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES. You can see our headquarters behind me, which is where I'm sitting at the moment. And I'll be moderating and also giving a short presentation and introduction later. Before I hand over to my colleagues from the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, or UNU-IAS, for an introduction to the topic and some additional information, I'll begin by introducing the speakers in the order that they appear. So first of all, Sunita Subramanian. Sunita, perhaps you can switch your camera on. Thank you. Sunita is a research fellow at UNU-IAS, and she's joining us from Tokyo, where they are headquartered. And next to her is also Rina Miyake, who won't be speaking, but she's also part of the team there. Next will be myself. I'll do a short presentation. I'm Director of Biodiversity and Forests Unit at IGES, and I'm based in this headquarters about an hour south of Tokyo in the seaside town of Hayama. Next up will be Catherine Mungai, who's a Senior Program Officer at IUCN's Regional Office for Eastern and Southern Africa. She's joining us, if I'm not mistaken, from Nairobi. And then you can see Catherine. And then Juan Ramos will be after Catherine. He's Senior Manager of Integrated Finance and Policy at Eco Agriculture Partners. Will be joining us from Guatemala, so very early morning over there. And then finally, Carlos is a Strategy and Planning Division Director at the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, or ACB, who will be joining us, or who is joining us from Manila. So thanks very much, guys. We can maybe keep your cameras on just until the end of my little intro here, and then we'll take turns after that. You'll hear short presentations on this broad topic by each of the participants, and then we'll follow that with a conversational question and answer session. So in this Zoom webinar, you can put questions into the question box at any stage. There's no chat box, so you can't communicate with us through a chat box, but you can post your questions at any stage. And we will respond to the questions after all of the presentations, which will be fairly short. So we'd like to get them all done and then have a conversation rather than interrupting the flow. But if there are any questions for clarification of particular points within the particular presentation, please include those questions as well, and we'll try and catch them at the end of the presentation that they are aimed at. But generally speaking, just write your Q&A in the Q&A, or your Q in the Q&A box, and we'll respond when the time comes. And with that, I will hand over to Sunita, and the rest of us can turn off our cameras until our turn comes to present. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you, Andre. And again, good day and a very warm welcome to all of you who joined us this day. So as Andre kindly mentioned, my name is Sunita Subramanian. I'm a researcher with the United Nations University's Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, which is the academic the UNU is the academic arm of the United Nations, for those of you who are not aware. And I'm just going to be sharing my screen because I have a very brief presentation on what we do. Yeah, all right. So just getting started, as Andrew mentioned, so the UNU Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, IAS, is based in Tokyo. We are one of 13 centers around the world, which is of the UNU, whose primary responsibility is to work on various issues related to sustainability to inform policy making. So it is a policy research think tank, and we work a lot on biodiversity, ecosystems, and human well-being related issues, on education and other related topics. So it's environment and people. Within the UNU-IAS, we have three major programs, but one program that we represent is called the Biodiversity and Society Program, which hosts the International Satoyama Initiative, which is an initiative that was adopted in 2010 as a response to by UNU and the Ministry of Environment Japan to promote activities relating to sustainable use on the ground, and linking it to policy objectives, primarily focusing on the biodiversity sector. So it is a response to the Convention on Biological Diversity's Conference of Parties number 10, which was held in Japan. And so since 2010, we've been active in this area, linking local priorities with global policy goals related to biodiversity and human well-being. So within the Satayama Initiative, we have a partnership. The Secretariat is hosted by UNU-IAS. The partnership is called the International Partnership for the Satayama Initiative, IPSI. It has more than 300 members comprising a broad spectrum of stakeholder groups from local communities, indigenous groups, also NGOs,
Sunita,
academics. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but could you just go into slideshow mode? It's a little bit small on the screen.
Okay. I thought it was in slideshow mode. Now is good?
Now it's good, yeah.
Okay, so the IPSI, the International Partnership, has members, as I said, from local communities, academics, academic institutions, NGOs, governments. We also have multilateral development banks and so on. So it's really a mixed bag. But what unites all of these organizations is the interest to promote local action that is aligned with sustainability principles and local production related action. So it is looking at how do we work across different stakeholders, because there are different types of priorities at a landscape level. So moving forward, what we promote really is through collaborative efforts, and that's very important. So we work with our various partners and also new partners, and different kinds of stakeholders at multiple levels in order to foster and to promote transdisciplinary integrated approaches relating biodiversity, ecosystems, and human well-being. So it is very much related to how decisions are made at multiple scales, but it's also related to it also has a solutions focus, because we're trying to ensure that multiple voices are heard and multiple issues are brought to the forefront, which might otherwise be hidden. So yes, we promote solutions-focused research, and I have some images of knowledge products that we developed, and there's one specific one that Andre will be speaking about in a bit, and also looking at training and capacity development for, again, various sets of stakeholders as appropriate. We definitely promote science policy practice linkages, and those could be through such dialogues such as this, ensuring that spaces are created for open and free and frank discussions. And of course, a big part of our work is in taking all of these, the lessons we learn and synthesize to advocate with policymakers, with various kinds of decision makers, and also to go and to ensure that we have more dissemination of this knowledge. And all of this is really looking at strengthening more effective and sustainable and implementation of sustainable solutions, especially linking biodiversity ecosystems with multiple other sectors, and what kinds of drivers exist that foster them, that hinder them, and that can facilitate better implementation. And in today's webinar, we will witness a flavor of the kinds of work that is happening, this diverse set of activities that is happening in different spheres, but are all interconnected when we start talking about a particular topic, in this case, landscape approaches, but also actions that we can, as individuals, as communities, as collectives, make towards more action, towards ensuring that the goals we've set for ourselves in terms of biodiversity conservation, sustainable utilization, and equity are met. I'll stop there, but I'm just leaving you with this slide. If you are interested in knowing more about us, please do visit our website. And also you can email us at this email ID. I'll stop here and over back to you, Andre.
Thanks very much, Sunita. I'll share my screen. Okay, as Sunita mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about this publication, which was also featured in her presentation. This is a guide that we produced only about 6 months ago, so it hasn't been out for very long. A collaboration between UNU-IAS, IGES, and the Secretariat of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as the title suggests, it's about using landscape approaches in national biodiversity strategy and action planning. So the idea here, and I think many of you listening will be familiar with all these acronyms and concepts, but just for those who are not, at the end of 2022, the Convention on Biological Diversity parties agreed on a new set of biodiversity targets, the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the framework includes the targets and also other components. And the idea is for each country in the world, or each of the countries who are party to the CBD, to use this framework as sort of a template for biodiversity planning and strategy at the national level. And the idea with this publication was making use of that situation and those circumstances, trying to inject the idea of landscape approaches into this process. And what I'll do is I'll just go through the 4 very simple components of the guide. And in doing so, especially on this first page, I'll also be talking a little bit about what this topic of landscape approaches is all about. So first of all, landscapes and seascapes, and you can also add waterscapes to that list if you want. But we use the word landscapes purely for the sake of efficiency, not to be exclusive in any way, because very often we are talking about seascapes or waterscapes. But landscapes, for the sake of efficiency, landscapes and seascapes are multi-dimensional mosaics of ecosystems and other land uses utilized by multiple stakeholders, and they generally involve diverse interactions between humans and nature. So, as I've said under the second bullet there, multiple uses, which could include biodiversity conservation, but also agriculture and industry and all sorts of other things. And then also within those uses, across those uses and within those uses are multiple users. And the whole idea with landscape approaches is, landscapes are this way. They have been for a long time now, since human beings have had such an impact and such an influence on the planet. Landscapes are multiple uses and multiple user phenomena. So our options are either to kind of ignore that and carry on with our own activities, which could come back to bite us in the end, or acknowledge the fact that there are multiple land users and multiple uses and try to manage the conflicts between them and really get them to work together. And that's really what landscape approaches are all about. And then the last bullet that I've got there, in which we discuss at some length in the manual, is spatial planning. So spatial planning is not a prerequisite for landscape approaches, but it's something which you probably would want to incorporate at some stage in the process. So it shouldn't get in the way of starting to use landscape approaches, but it can be time consuming and resource consuming to have a spatial plan. So it's kind of something for a little bit later along in the process. And we discuss in the manual how to go about doing that. The second component of the manual is how to actually apply or operationalize landscape approaches. So the manual itself is mostly about integrating them at the national level. And usually landscape approaches are not applied nationally, they're applied at the local level. In some cases, they are applied by national governments. For example, national park, you might want to, especially multiple use national park, might be perfect for applying landscape approaches. But we wanted to just kind of go over the actual process for those cases, and also for national policymakers and others to be able to understand what they're talking about when they're promoting this whole idea of landscape approaches. And so we go through these 5 steps, and these are not prescriptive. They are subjective to some extent. You might want to rename them or reorder them, or maybe add or subtract from them. But the idea is to start off by identifying the boundaries of the landscape or seascape and its stakeholders. And the stakeholders often define what those boundaries are going to be. Then to convene those stakeholders and to establish objectives together. Those objectives, as I mentioned, are often going to clash with each other, but part of the idea of landscape approaches is managing those clashes and those conflicts. And then the mapping and the planning goes back to the spatial plan that I mentioned earlier on, very important, but sometimes a later part of the process. And then lastly, monitoring, so that lessons can be learned when the next iteration of the process goes through. And then the main part of the manual, and the bulk of it, is on integrating landscape approaches into NBSAPs, National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. And the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned earlier on has these 23 targets. And as I mentioned, the idea is that countries take those targets, apply them to the national level, sometimes adjusted to the national context. And our goal here was to, as I said, inject landscape approaches into that process. So what we've done is, these are the three kind of levels that we've identified. Again, a subjective categorization, but I think it makes sense. We've identified the targets where landscape approaches are pretty much implicit in the target, for example, target 1. Others where they're less explicit, they're there if you look for them, but maybe less explicit. And then others where it might need to be pointed out how landscape approaches can be applied. So in each of these cases, we point out where and how landscape approaches can be applied, and then also which indicators could be used to determine progress in applying landscape approaches. The same section has a few examples from different parts of the world, in this case, Kenya, just demonstrations of how landscape approaches have been applied in different parts of the world, and also which of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets are most relevant to those examples. And then finally, we have a section, and this might sound like a bit of just an add-on, these additional considerations, but there are important factors which might not be covered by NBSAPs, by National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. And the first of these is where to focus landscape approaches. So we talk in the manual, in the guide, about, for example, identifying areas of very high biodiversity importance, or areas where there are biodiversity champions already in place, which means that it might be a lot easier to make landscape approaches happen. Then we also have a section there on national government support for implementation, different ways that national government policymakers can support local governments and various other stakeholders. And then a section on monitoring, review, and reporting. So I mentioned that earlier on, but that was in the context of actually applying a landscape approach at the local level. This is referring more to the national level and the overview. And then lastly, other policy and strategy at the national level. And what that refers to is, for example, master plans, and this can be especially at a local government level. Very often there's a master plan which covers all sectors. It can also be sectoral plans, which are not, they operate in parallel with NBSAPs rather than in conjunction with NBSAPs. So we just discuss all those and how landscape approaches can be applied to all of those different factors. So that's a very brief overview of the manual. The manual itself is pretty short. It's about 40 pages, including references and diagrams and all the rest of it. And you can find it at this link over here. And Karoshima-san, who's supporting this webinar, I think will paste it in the chat so that you can all access the manual easily. This is on the UNU-IAS website. And please also feel free, if you'd like to ask questions about the manual, if you have any inputs, also if you have any case studies that you think could be added to future iterations of the manual, please feel free to contact Sunita or myself. We'd be very happy to hear from you. And with that, I will end my presentation. I see Karoshima-san has shared the link, so please, you'll see on the webinar chat, you can't use the chat as a participant, but you can access it and you can click on the link. So please do so. But with that, I would like to hand over to our next presenter. We're kind of rushing through these presentations because we'd like to get them over so we can have some conversation. But our next presenter is Catherine Mungai, as I mentioned, from IUCN. And Catherine will be talking about helping the Kenyan government with their NBSAP. And this is more NBSAP focused than landscape approaches focused, but I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye out for ways in which landscape approaches are relevant to this presentation. So Catherine, I see your screen. If you could just switch to slideshow mode, then you're ready to go.
Yeah, so thanks very much. And yes, as Andre said, my name is Catherine Mungai. I work with the International Union for Conservation of Nature with the Kenya Country Office. And I'm very excited today to be sharing some of the work that we are doing together with the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry, the CBD office specifically, supported by, of course, IUCN and through the BioDev 2030 project, where we are working towards establishing a national biodiversity mechanism. And I feel this links very well with what Andre has just talked about, because when it comes to the restoration of biodiversity or protecting, conserving biodiversity, a landscape approach is one of the approaches that would be quite ideal. And when we talk about using a landscape approach, we're talking about multiple users, and we're talking about multiple uses. So, and also linking to the NBSAP and to the GBF targets. These are 23 targets. And you can imagine that we are working with actors from different sectors, different landscapes, different institutions. So we have been brainstorming how can we develop a mechanism that is going to help us coordinate all these actors. And just to put it into context, the National Biodiversity Coordinating Mechanism fits in very well and aligns with the GBF Target 14, which is talking about integrating biodiversity in decision making at different levels. So whether it's at the national level, at the county level, or at the community local level, there's the need to adopt a whole of government and whole of society approach. And this entails bringing together actors from different levels of government, but also from private institutions, from NGOs, community-based organizations. We're talking about the IPLC, we're talking about the youth, we're talking about gender groups. So really it's about bringing together a diverse range of stakeholders in order to ensure that all our needs and priorities are met. So definitely it makes sense having a kind of a coordinating mechanism. So the goal of the coordinating mechanism is to facilitate and enhance coordination of biodiversity related activities and initiatives in Kenya. And ideally, this is to support the ministry to not only to coordinate, but also when it comes to monitoring, reporting, and evaluating biodiversity actions. The coordinating mechanism and the different actors will be able then to come together to support when it comes to reporting. So as you can see, these are about 7 objectives, because we're talking about 23 targets, we're talking about different actors, but the main objective is to strengthen the coordination of actors for the effective implementation of Kenya's NBSAP. But then we also want to focus on how can we, bring in relevant actors to advise and inform the decision-making processes as related to biodiversity policies. We also want to facilitate partnerships, collaboration, to enhance communication and also information sharing. And then we also need to strengthen the mainstreaming of biodiversity across all sectors. I know there have been quite a number of, there have been discussions on integrating biodiversity into the climate change space. So this, climate change space. So there's definitely a need to see how we can then strengthen the mainstreaming of biodiversity. And then, of course, we'll need resources. So whether we're talking about financial resources, technical resources, capacity building, whether it is data storage, machinery, and all that. So we need to enhance resource mobilization towards to support biodiversity conservation, and of course, to foster the integration of science and policy. So I know Andre has talked about the tools that have been developed to enhance a landscape approach. And now if we look at it from the science perspective, how does this then inform policy development and even implementation, but at the same time ensuring that we integrate indigenous knowledge. And then finally, of course, like I mentioned, is to support the planning, monitoring, review of biodiversity actions in Kenya. So basically, I won't really get into this, but the idea of this governance structure is that we're going to have a national steering committee that is going to be the main decision-making body, and this is going to steer the coordinating mechanism, and this is going to be housed in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry and Climate Change, where the CBD office sits. And then, of course, we'll have the Technical Advisory Committee that is going to offer technical advice and mainly reporting to the National Steering Committee. But the engine and the heart of the National Biodiversity Coordination Mechanism, I feel, is the thematic working groups. So the thematic working groups have been structured to align with the 23 targets of the GBF, and mainly along for example, the first broad group of categories will be focusing on reducing threats to biodiversity. Then we have So this is more on the ecosystem restoration, applying of the landscape approach. And then the second group is focusing on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. And then finally is the tools and solutions for implementation. So the means of implementation here is where we have the fundraising, where we have the monitoring and reporting discussions. So basically that is how we have envisioned structuring the thematic working groups. And then finally, of course, we need a secretariat that is going to be able to manage the day-to-day running of the coordination mechanism. And the proposal is that the secretariat is, of course, for sustainability purposes, the secretariat is going to sit at the Ministry of Environment offices, and then will also comprise of other key actors who are supporting biodiversity actions in the country. So I think I will stop there, Andre. I think that is a good summary and overview of the coordinating mechanism, and I would be happy to keep sharing our experiences and lessons learned even as we continue with the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Really interesting stuff. And I have a couple of specific questions for you later on, but I'll be patient. Right, so we'll move straight on to Juan Ramos, and Juan is going to be talking about, we've heard sort of a national level example now from Africa, and now we're going to have a more local, not quite local, but sort of local regional example from Peru. And I won't say any more than that, Juan, because you've got all the information in front of you there, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Andre. Hi, everyone. So I'll talk a little bit about a case study that we developed for San Martin as a region, and more specifically in the Alto Maya landscape, and also linking it to a publication we recently published last year in relation to the NBSAP and the biodiversity finance plan process. So we co-developed this and authored it with the Ministry of the Netherlands, Biofin and Wolf's Company, thinking about also how lessons learned from integrated landscape management and approaches, but also finance can support this new GBF process, and linking finance and resource mobilization much more closely with the biodiversity strategies and action plans. Within that, just for context, kind of we use the framing of integrated landscape finance as kind of the process of how to plan and organize also the financial and resource mobilization needs of the strategies and action plans, because of kind of the reality that if you don't really have the resources, your strategies and your action plans may be ineffective because you simply can't implement them. So within kind of this analysis that was done, one case study in the report that we really highlighted was the one in San Martin and Alto Mayo, which is a very biodiverse, rich area that has a lot of different ecosystemic as well as species value, which is being prioritized by the government of Peru. And that is kind of being worked on, and how to implement really these plans at a more regional and landscape scale level. So a bit of kind of background on how they got to the point of working on more the implementation side and also resource mobilization was really thinking about how to contextualize the landscape approach and the finance component of that, where spatial targeting coordination is really essential and necessary. So for them, kind of the integration across biodiversity and climate is kind of at the base of how they're working and how they're trying to implement and conserve. But it also needs to extend to thinking about how that works at intergovernmental level, cross-ministerial coordination, and also how to implement these things on the ground. So kind of from the perspective of a lot of the stakeholders that we work with in San Martin, a big component of the turning point in the process was really how to bring in the main directors and advisors within the governmental offices, so that you could learn from what had already been done, what had been successful and what hadn't, and what were the real coordination mechanisms that could make that work over time. So kind of to really sum it up as well, is that they basically co-developed a vision to work on deforestation, but also thinking about really kind of these socio-ecological values of what that actually means within the context of San Martin. So in the region, they really rooted a lot of this analysis and thinking about kind of economic development plans with multi-objective goals, but really kind of spatially targeting landscape and territorial scales, kind of underpinning that as a strategy. Also within that, they really thought about really what was the root cause analysis of deforestation, of the loss of ecosystemic services over time, and then really kind of work to make their entry points spatially targeted and based on land planning. So kind of within that is the entire idea of how to integrate functions and how to make sure the government offices, even kind of at a regional level and at a landscape level, are coordinating much more closely rather than kind of the siloed approach that often happens. Within that, kind of there was 4 priority landscapes that were focused on. These were basically the ones with the highest deforestation rates, and generally also the ones with the highest economic development indicators or productive focus from an agricultural perspective. So really thinking about how to generate the desired changes, but also kind of segmenting those strategies and actions within each of those territorial realities and within those landscapes particularly. Within this, they also had kind of an investment plan attached to this general strategy. So how could they really fund and resource a lot of the interventions that were there? And a lot of the main interventions were kind of, getting better data, making sure that there was better information available for decision making, coordination on how processes could be co-invested in by philanthropy or bilateral and multilateral donors, and really finding ways in which agricultural productivity, extensionism, and protected area management could be better funded. However, there was quite a significant funding shortfall, which was around kind of more than 80%. So then finding ways to mitigate that was kind of a bit of a question we had when we started working also in the region with them. And what ended up happening is kind of the larger regional investment plan was seen as too difficult to fund. And so kind of working more at the landscape scale level, connecting always to those biodiversity targets, to kind of the priorities that are framed within the larger regional plan, was a bit of kind of the question of how to do that. So we've gone through a process in Alto Mayo of basically localizing even further from the regional level, which basically takes the NBSAP and also the NDC goals and puts that into kind of a regional context, which is framed within this kind of vision, strategies, and action plans. And then thinking more at the landscape level, how to get really to the point of also implementing and funding these activities over time. So within this, we've done kind of various different steps, but particularly it's been thinking about how to really segment priority investments and basically that are linked to actions, and how they can be economically feasible and how they can be presented to different funders, and ensuring that government expenditures can be aligned and much better coordinated to make those a reality. So this kind of, shows a bit of kind of the difference of the different components that we see as being very important. The landscape scale monitoring component is particularly essential here, about seeing how to really measure and communicate progress over time. And that's being used through kind of the landscape platform and its implementation, always capacity, knowledge, learning exchange, and really thinking about where capacity is needed most and how it's needed. And then also thinking about really how can you develop pipelines of different projects and actions, how they can be connected and funded without really also losing that inclusion lens, particularly of Indigenous peoples and women. This kind of provides just a very short and quick map of kind of spatially and also some connections of like where you would see different components being important, protected area management, conservation corridors, but also thinking about the policies, the capacities, and the different mechanisms. RED has been quite essential for particularly securing the upper watershed and activities in relation to ensuring more sustainable agricultural practices, particularly with coffee. And then finally, just to wrap up, because I know I'm probably already over time, from the publication, the analysis we did, San Martin and Alto Mayo was one of the main case studies, but we also analyzed some others, and we did a pretty thorough review of NBSAPs and biodiversity finance plans in the past. So these are some specific recommendations that have also come out of really thinking about and taking advantage of the opportunity of really finding integration across biodiversity and climate, and also really focusing on what that means from a financial perspective to really enable action. So what does cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder policy coordination look like? Similar to what the manual was being mentioned from Andre, was basically how can you really do spatial targeting much more effectively and much more context-based to enable better decision-making, thinking about promoting different finance models that can underpin a lot of these things over the longer term. Thinking about how private sector investment can also support a lot of these place-based plans where critical sourcing areas for companies and for supply chains are. Thinking about how to really support longer term landscape level institutions and how those can be linked for collaborative finance. And then finally, really a bit more of the technical guidance for how at a national level, the NBSAP and the NBFP or the finance plan coordination can really be linked together over time. So I'll leave it at that, and sorry if I ran over a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. Very interesting stuff, Juan. Thank you very much. Keen to get into some of that detail in a moment as well. But before we do, I'll hand over to our final presenter, who's Carlos. So we've now heard from Africa at the national level and from Latin America at the local level, and now back to Asia and the ASEAN region in particular. And Carlos is going to be telling us about a regional strategy and action plan that ACB is working with. So please go ahead, Carlo.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah. Good evening again here from Manila. It's my pleasure, of course, to share with you some of the steps that we're taking with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in terms of crafting a regional biodiversity strategy and action plan. So I'm Carlos, Strategy and Planning Division Director for the ACB. And we work hand in hand with the ASEAN member states in crafting this important strategy for the next 6 years until 2030. Just to provide a context on the basis for setting up an ASEAN biodiversity plan, as we call it. So we're taking off from this COP decision on encouraging non-government actors to develop strategies, enhancing capacity development, building and development initiatives to implement the KMGBF. Of course, if you would notice as well, the past iteration, the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020, there's a explicit a statement where it says that it's really encouraged for IGOs to develop regional action plans. But in this case, we're taking the initiative to put forward regional targets, of course, in line with the ACB's mandate and with the ASEAN's role, of course, in facilitating cooperation and coordination among the members of the ASEAN national governments, regional international organizations on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, the equitable sharing benefits from its use, at least in the region. So that's where we are coming from, and later on, it really goes in place wherein the ASEAN is also in the process of recrafting its vision. So I'll be taking that up later on. So just to have a clear delineation of what the ASEAN Biodiversity Plan is. So it intends to support the ASEAN member states in implementing their respective NBSAPs through regional initiatives and approaches. It will also be able to identify common ASEAN community-wide concerns relating to biodiversity that may be carried out the national level, and of course, most especially if it will require region-wide approaches. So the intent really is not to overlap with the respective NBSAPs, but again, given the ACB's role, it really it facilitates the entire region in towards biodiversity action. So yeah, in terms of the alignments, so it takes cognizance of the biodiversity plan, other multilateral environmental agreements, so including the Ramsar, among others, and the UNFCCC, of course. Okay, so what I would like to point out here now is that the ASEAN is currently crafting its the ASEAN Community Vision 2045. So so the current vision is about to end next year, and it also comes right smack in the process. So on one hand, that we're already crafting a regional biodiversity plan, And the other thing is it's also in the it's like some sort of an alignment of all the different plans and frameworks that have been developed in the ASEAN. So it's an opportunity for us, to link biodiversity across the different sectors. If you it will take perhaps another session to just to understand the ASEAN process, but the idea is that it will be able to cut across the different sectors, as it is in the biodiversity plan, where it calls for for everybody's involvement, basically. So in here, we're also take off from existing framework from the comprehensive recovery framework. This is in line with the COVID pandemic, how we're going to build back better and perhaps prevent future pandemics. And the different action plans on invasive alien species, also with the ASEAN One Health Joint Plan of Action, and I think Sunita was we were able to coordinate with UNU previously, and some of these actions are actually being taken up through this regional plan. Okay, so some of the key elements would include, of course, biodiversity conservation and ecosystem restoration. I guess more emphasis would go on the transboundary protected area management, and how would be what would be management mechanisms in terms of expanding key biodiversity areas. So those are some of the things that may be of special focus. In terms of mainstreaming biodiversity, I think it has been mentioned as well a while by the other speaker, in terms of the importance of mainstreaming biodiversity, especially on the aims of the KMGBF, that on how we should be able to reach out to the different sectors on communicating what biodiversity is. Of course, other features would include biodiversity and climate change, its alignment as well with the UNFCCC, sustainable use and access and benefit sharing. We're looking for commonalities or shared values in terms of what would be the common ground for the 10 member states to work on. Because as you know, the Southeast Asian region is mixed. It has a mixture of developed and developing countries. So how do we find that common ground for all of us to work on? And then, of course, capacity development, technology transfer, of course, on communication, education, and public awareness. And I think from previous discussions with the CBD, this is actually identified as one of the most important components. We have to really communicate what biodiversity is, especially to those who are quite unfamiliar with what biodiversity is. So it's really just it's more than just the plants and animals. Of course, we're looking on actions for resource mobilization and financing. Okay, so we've had series of consultations already in the ASEAN member states. So we had one in August and in January here in Manila. So it's still a continuing process. But in terms of the next step, again, there will be further consultations, but we hope to proceed with the ASEAN process of the endorsement, and ultimately having this launched at the CBD COP16. So as early as now, we're already working on possible KMGBF support to the ASEAN member states, especially in implementing this regional plan, proposed regional plan. So number one, of course, is on the monitoring systems. How do we engage further non-state actors? Mainstreaming in the forestry sector with FAO. Of course, we'll continue working with the protected area management, OECMs, and the other different networks to enhance management effectiveness. We're also looking at youth and gender and knowledge management. So these are all of these are in the pipeline, and we hope to operationalize eventually. Yeah, so that's it. No, I'll end that point, and yeah, over to you, Andre.
Thanks very much, Carlo. Really interesting stuff. I think perhaps if all the panelists can just turn their cameras on, and we'll kind of get the discussion started. We have received a few questions and answers, and Sunita and I have been responding to some of them, and I think some of those ones we'll revisit later. I have a few of my own, and I'll start off with one for you, Carlo. But just to let you know that everybody is still welcome to add questions to the question boxes. We do have time now to get through quite a few, so I'm just going to ask a couple, or let's say one to each of the presenters, just to get the conversation started. Carlo, I wanted to ask you one, and we spoke about this a little bit before the discussion, but I don't know what your answer is. So just regarding, the idea of a regional biodiversity strategy and action plan, we all know that policymakers are very busy, right? National level policymakers and local policymakers as well. So, and they are expected to produce an NBSAP, and they already have this global set of targets. So what is the kind of value added through a regional plan on top of the national plans?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think when we were actually in the initial stage of brainstorming on crafting a regional biodiversity plan, that was actually one of the first questions, because the national governments were quite had some concern in terms of overlaps, in terms of capturing the metrics or the targets. So of course, this is a continuing consultation with them, and we really have to ensure that what we're doing in the region, or the corresponding actions that we will be doing will, number one, support what they are implementing at the national level. So just to ensure that there are no overlaps again. So I might be repetitive on that, but that was also the direction as well from the national governments that we're working with. So that's one. And another one, we're trying to look at specific areas where it cannot be done by single country alone. So we have transboundary protected areas wherein it cuts across two countries. That's a potential entry point on what we may be doing to further improve protected area management or conservation of not necessarily protected areas, but on important biodiversity areas. No? So that's one. And another one is on the how we were able. It's on the capacity development. So we would like to enhance capacities of our ASEAN member states, no, to further solidify their work on attaining their respective commitments, no, in the KMGBF. So that would be quite the focus of what we will be doing in this national. Anyway, we will also be doing this, no, because we have the ASEAN Working Group on Nature Conservation and Biodiversity Action Plan. No? So it's really a set of priority actions from that sector. No? But now we're looking here at a bigger scale. No? So we're reaching out actually on the what we call the cross-sector, cross-pillar, wherein we engage the economic sectors. No? And but of course, that's still up to the discussion. No? If they will be taking this up in their respective work plans once the community vision is adopted.
Right.
Yeah.
I would imagine that also, this does provide the opportunity for ASEAN with its convening function and, its general overview of what's going on in the sub-region. It gives you the chance to coordinate, right? And to help countries to speak to each other, because at the CBD level, there's just too many countries for that to happen efficiently. So, right. Okay. The problem with these questions is that each one of them could easily be a half-hour conversation. But I'll jump on to the next one. I'll jump on to one for you, Juan. I just wanted to find out from you, and this might be a little bit off focus, but something I was wondering, looking at the draft of your presentation, was, as with the manual, landscape approaches is something that can come from different angles. It can come, you could be an agriculturalist, for example, and apply landscape approaches from an agricultural perspective. And I was thinking specifically about the agricultural perspective. So you're coming and we're coming from a biodiversity perspective, but how do you, especially when funding is involved, how do you kind of get the agriculturalists and other land users on board, you know, if your perspective is a biodiversity perspective?
Right now, appreciate the question, Andre. Right, so at Eco Agriculture, this is actually in the name of our organization because that's kind of what we've been thinking about and looking at in relation to biodiversity and really the effectiveness of how to work with agriculture, which in the end tends to be within most of the biodiversity rich areas that we have, particularly among the developing world. So it really is based on incentives. And at the end of the day, really thinking about how you can integrate those incentives into economic decision making at an individual level and also at a multi-scale level is really where we see the rubber hits the road. Because if there isn't an economically viable way to produce sustainably, it simply is not going to happen. So in the context, for example, of coffee, thinking about different kind of agroforestry systems that can be implemented that can be supported for producers, we see as being the really only viable way forward. Because at the end of the day, there isn't enough resources to go around in most places, particularly agricultural landscapes that are alternatives to agriculture. So thinking about how to really blend in different incentive mixes from subsidies, but also from markets in relation to biodiversity positive action is essential there, and working even with financial institutions so that different credit lines, finance products can be developed which have measurable positive impacts on biodiversity is an important part. But it really needs to be a mix of economic incentives because it's the only real way to think about longer term sustainability.
Okay, interesting. And Catherine, I actually wanted to ask you a pretty similar question, just maybe a little bit more general even, but how do you, in the Kenyan context, how do you get the buy-in of non-conservation actors, including agriculture, but all the others as well, and especially those whose activities are not necessarily good for conservation, you know, because I think, like, to me, one of the key kind of aspects of landscape approaches is that they deal with trade-offs. They're all about trade-offs between different the different land uses. So in your context, like, are there particular ideas that you have about getting that buy-in from the non-conservation actors?
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I think that's a great question, and it's something that we keep talking about, even with different partners here, about shifting away from preaching to the choir. So we need to see how can we bring in other stakeholders who are not within the conservation space or the biodiversity space. And I think one of the key things I feel, in my opinion, is the issue of awareness. We need to raise awareness about the impact of different, so the impact that different actors have on biodiversity. So I think, to me, that is one of the key areas that we need to focus on, and of which of course, we've started, but I feel like a lot more still needs to be done. And I think when we are looking at, for example, the private sector companies, like even the banks, or just other companies that rely a lot on that focus more on capital and making money, I think we also need to demonstrate what is the impact of their activities, but from a financial perspective, because I think that is the language that they speak. So sometimes when we talk about, okay, that these species are becoming extinct, but what does that mean, for example, directly to these actors? So what, for example, does that cost? What is the impact to that particular person in terms of the financial implications? So I think And IUCN has also been undertaking this natural ecosystem accounting. So using tools such as this, you're able then to demonstrate from a financial perspective, what is the impact of the different activities on biodiversity? What does it cost? And, if we continue doing things the same way, what are the implications? And if we change, what are the implications? So I think those are some of the things that we've started doing, and so some of the things that we can continue to do is really, one, raise awareness. And I feel like when it comes to, we're talking about biodiversity, but I feel like for climate change, a lot has been done. And I think also because the impacts of climate change is something that we can see, and we're increasingly seeing, especially like in Kenya right now, we are having these floods, and can be attributed to perhaps climate change, but it is something, and also the drought, the impact of drought. So these are things that we are able to see and attribute to climate change. But now, when it comes to biodiversity loss, we need to find a way to continue talking about it, and we need to really step out of our box and really see how we can bring in, other actors who are affected also, and whose activities have an impact. So I think that would be my short intervention for now. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I think Juan might have something to add there. Juan, I had a next question was actually for you as well from one of the participants, but why don't you go ahead with your question first?
No, I just really wanted to highlight the importance of language and also communicating effectively to the decision makers, particularly from economics and finance. This is something we found very particularly in the report, which is that in the NBSAP process, ministries of environment really need to think much more effectively and much more economically in terms of how to communicate with these decision makers who will really decide on public expenditures. Because without doing that, really the strategy and the action plan may be perfect, but if you can substantiate it in the negotiation tables with your Ministry of Planning, Economics, or Finance, you're simply going to lose out on the resources versus the more traditional ministry. So really being able to think about how to communicate biodiversity values from an economic perspective and how those underpin economic activities at their core really is essential kind of in these conversations, because if not, we end up with kind of plans that stay on a shelf but aren't implementable because there's no resources attached to them.
And environmental ministries often start off with a bit of a disadvantage as well, right? Because they're often the smaller and the less funded ministries, so they've got an uphill battle from the start. Sunita, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I actually had a follow-on question to I guess Juan is the best placed here to speak about this. So one of the things that keeps coming up when we speak to our partners is about access to finance at source, at the place where the production activities happen. So, and that is usually the banks, the branches of banks at the local level. And often the criteria used for lending doesn't account for biodiversity or sustainability outcomes, right? So the benefit cost ratio is usually not in favor of getting the loans that they require, and they're not really huge amounts, but even so they don't qualify often is what they say. But in your work, Juan, in your work with different kinds of lending institutions, have you been able to influence, or have you seen that banks are, in these more formal lending institutions would be open to take on board more criteria that looks at other non-monetary outcomes in their benefit cost calculations?
So I mean, I think that the reality is that conventional lending has no obligation or mandate to do this. So unless there's an incentive provided for them or a reason why they would do it, the answer is it won't happen on its own. There are a lot of examples where it has been undertaken. So in the example of actually San Martin in Peru and kind of like the national, they have like local lending cooperatives of sorts that they have integrated different lending practices where basically your interest rate fluctuates depending on whether you achieve the practices or outcomes that you like pre-agreed upon. And so it's quite significant because it can be like plus 2% or minus 2% on terms of annual loans that you may have. So for agricultural production, that is pretty significant. There's also different credit lines that multilateral development banks have provided to local institutions to institute these practices. So there are several examples on that as well. The real difficulty and the real thing to consider though here is that the credibility of these integration of indicators within lending practices is very dependent on the ability to monitor their outcomes. And if you're working with smallholder farmers, the transaction cost per plot is actually quite significant, even if technology has enabled this and is becoming cheaper over time. So for most banks, the reality is that they're not going to have a GIS person or someone doing like information monitoring. So finding ways to support that and how it's instituted and lessons learned on how that can be applied is a really important thing here, because in the end, you're asking for a financial institution to increase their cost structure without actually getting an increase in revenue or profit for doing so. So in most cases, it really does need to be subsidized in different ways. And there have been different models for how that can be done. But really looking at kind of the local banking institutions, it's really important to also realize like these are also the institutions that financially also have the least capacity because they're the local branches. So even if you may be linked to a very large bank, once you actually get to a rural area, the branches are not necessarily very sophisticated from a information technology perspective, and the ability of credit officers to really analyze these indicators is something that they've never had to do. So the capacity there is pretty lacking.
Thanks for that, Juan. I wanted to move on to some of the participant questions, and some of these have been answered, but I can't actually tell if they were answered privately or not. So I'm not sure if everyone has view of these. So just assuming that you haven't all read them, I was wondering, Oliver Hillel has joined, and is whenever Oliver is involved, he's always got lots of contributions to make. So, Oliver, thanks so much for that. It's lovely to be on the same platform as you. It's been a while. But I wanted to, I know Sunita has responded to some of your questions, and you asked, first of all, how IDES and IPSI and UNU plan to incentivize the application of the manual that I presented. And Sunita, I was wondering if, because you've already provided the answer to Oliver, would you like to just give us sort of a quick elevator pitch answer so that everyone else knows as well?
Sure. So we've been working, we've been trying to persuade UNDP and UNEP. They are convinced, but convince them more to actually use the guide in their activities to support early action support for countries to update their NBSAPs and guide. But apart from that, we're also engaging with the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. We are a partner, and they've used our guide. They will include our guide as part of their solutions toolkit. But then they have these matchmaking runs that they do between those who seek assistance and those who can provide assistance, and they could be technical assistance or financial assistance. And we are trying to provide guidance in the form of organizing interactive workshops. So we would have to design how those workshops would look like, but we're considering more and more that we should bring on board other partners and colleagues who work on specific elements within the guide, like for instance, financing or developing maps and other tools that we highlight. So it provides the kind of capacities that countries are looking for in how to have these kinds of integrated approaches, which actually resonates with the whole of society, achieving the whole of society approach. The other avenue we're looking at is also the NBSAP Accelerator Partnership. So we're trying to become a partner there too. There is interest; it's under discussion. But so all of these are these big processes where we can target the countries, right? Directly the focal points who will be involved with the NBSAP development and implementation. So that's an activity, but of course, it's not just at that level. We need a lot more at the subnational level, as Oliver rightly pointed out. In that and we should be looking at how we can take this forward through our contacts, our networks, how this can be, disseminated more. That's something that, yeah, so anyone who can, it's basically, it's work for all of us to do. I think we're all doing parts of the puzzle, so if we can get together, that would be really nice.
Thanks, Sunita. Okay, on to a completely different question, and this might be a little bit outside the purview of this discussion, but when you're talking about MBSAFs, basically anything goes, right? Because it includes the whole lot. So Marcel de Vries was asking, when it comes to baseline measuring and monitoring of biodiversity, what methods are considered, and what are your professional opinions on eDNA? So two questions there. The one is a very general one, and the one is a more specific one. But I just thought I've got a couple of sort of minor contributions to that one. But if anyone else would like to jump in there. So first of all, any sort of general considerations on measuring and monitoring biodiversity, perhaps in your particular context, and secondly, specifically eDNA and how worthwhile is it? What do you think of it? Would anyone like to weigh in on that? If not, I'm happy to give a few semi-informed opinions. If not, I'll just, so as far as eDNA is concerned, I've just heard, via experts. I'm certainly not an expert myself, but I know that it's something which it's a field which is in its infancy, but is growing incredibly rapidly, and the technology is so advanced in a short period of time. So I said it's in its infancy, but it's already grown so much that apparently a paper was written recently where they were able to measure with a sample of air, so not soil or water, but air. They were able to measure what creatures had been in the area recently. So it's become that advanced in a very short time. It is limited in the sense that all that it'll tell you is what has been there, which species have been in the area. So, for example, the density of species and whether they're transitory or resident and that kind of thing is cannot be determined. But it definitely seems like an incredibly valuable tool, and we'll be looking with interest to see how it develops. With regards to the more general question on measuring and monitoring biodiversity, I think this is a little broad, I think, and also context specific. We're looking at different scales here and also different parts of the world. So I think it would very much depend on the particular context. But I see that Catherine might have something to add there as well. Please go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, sure. Not on the eDNA, but I think regarding the baseline monitoring and baseline information, I just maybe wanted to mention 3 tools that IUCN has. There could be others, but we have the red list of threatened species. We have the red list of ecosystems, and then the key biodiversity areas, amongst other tools. But I feel like these are this could help us be able to monitor the baseline of biodiversity. And interesting is that, for example, we have, it's at the global level, but Kenya is also in the process of but they're planning to actually undertake a national red list of ecosystem, because you find that when everything is aggregated at the global level, it may not be a true picture of what is, of what is happening on the ground, of what is happening at the national level. So some of the institutions, the Wildlife Research Training Institution has initiated a process of undertaking a national red list of ecosystems. So that gives us the baseline, and then we can continue to track, say if it's with the GBF over the next few years to get to 2030 and 2050, how we are doing. So I hope that's a bit useful. Thanks.
Yeah, very useful. And IUCN's, I mean, anyone who's visited their website will know what a comprehensive library of guides and some of the documentation there is there. So there's really a lot to look at. Okay, unless anyone else would like to add to that, I'll go on to another question, which is again maybe a little bit general, but Juan, it was aimed at you in particular, I think, because it's about Peru. Mariana Pimenta wanted to know, did the proper financing reduce deforestation in Peru, and how so? So perhaps if that's too general, perhaps if you have any particular examples to cite, it might be useful.
Yeah, I tried answering a bit in the chat, but I can give it a go kind of here. So a lot of the financing in relation to supporting deforestation was actually developed in terms of government priorities around supply chains that were causing most of it. So how to think about strategies of financing alternative practices, understanding really production incentives. So from a coffee perspective, there was a lot of degradation going on in relation to the practices going into protected area management, also because of productivity loss over time, and also kind of just shifts in the cost structure of coffee given the fluctuations in price. So organizing cooperatives, developing much more targeted extensionism and technical assistance for agroforestry systems was one of the key areas that helped to reduce that over time. And also working on protected area management in relation to conservation agreements with producer families, with indigenous communities, all had kind of a very big impact on this. Within the policy framework in Peru, there's actually 7 different designations of protected area management. And so we did a lot of analysis on really costing out what each of them were at in terms of support and where were the gaps. So then trying to find financial mechanisms that could be reworked or even just like newly established to inject funding and resources into those specific areas was really a priority. And so that's really in the process of what we've been in now. Conservation International has been very active in the landscape for a very long time, so they've implemented a lot of this work over the years, and it has been very effective in at least reducing deforestation in the priority watershed areas. In kind of more of the urban-rural linkages component, particularly as it goes into more urbanization areas and everything, it's much more difficult because the incentive structure and the amount of money that goes into developing new infrastructure is a very different kind of conversation. And so the power imbalances and the ways to engage those processes are a bit more difficult. But on the production end, that's been how it's been worked on.
Great, thank you. There's also a question by, and I see, Sunita, you've provided a brief answer, but perhaps we can discuss this a bit further. I'm just going to read the whole thing out because it'll probably be quicker than me trying to paraphrase it. But Robert Campolone, forgive me for pronouncing that wrong if I have, but Robert said, landscape approaches have traditionally been discussed within the context of giving landscape stakeholders a voice at the table. Today's webinar demonstrates how landscape approaches are transforming from being solely focused on governance as a means that gives stakeholders a voice to governance as a means of financially empowering stakeholders so they can not only survive and thrive in their landscapes economically, but to do so in an environmentally sustainable way. So environmental sustainability as well as economic sustainability. That seems to be the real challenge at hand, this idea of both environmental and economic sustainability. Sunita, you provided a small answer there, but would you like to expand on that a little bit? You've obviously thought about this a little bit already.
Sure. I mean, the work that we do with landscape approaches is really a systems approach, no? So it's looking at both the uses and sort of different functions. So yes, it is a very utilitarian approach, if you want to say it at one level, if you're looking at but it also has the tangibles and the intangible functions that a landscape provides for people. And so when we are advocating for this landscape approach, we are embedding so many different priorities in there that speaks to what people can gain instrumentally from the landscape. So in terms of income, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of resources, a lot of things that we can get, right? But it's also looking at the landscape itself, the ecosystem integrity itself, because that's necessary to be very well, very, how do you say this? Good functional, right? High integrity is necessary, and only then can you actually achieve the other end of the story, which is all about the benefits that we accrue. So, and it's an interactive space. So interconnectedness is very well acknowledged, and it's like a basis from which we think of all our interventions. So it is what we call the socio-ecological system itself. It goes beyond just looking at a food system and a health system. No, it actually cuts across all of that because it's intervening and interlinkages across them. And we speak about about resilient systems. So the socio-ecological system is vulnerable to multiple social, economic, political, and environmental perturbations. There could be different kinds of disturbances, and that's okay. But what's not okay is that if we get hit and we fall back and are not able to recover. No, so the whole resilience concept is that we are able to pick up and move on. That we have buffers in place, and that requires again that we ensure that the system is resilient. And there's a lot that's already, there's a lot of thinking that's gone into this across, it's not just the research communities, but across practice communities and practitioner communities. And that's what we are trying to advocate through the landscape approach. So it's not just about, it's not, it wasn't, so yes, it's about rights, it's about power hierarchies and breaking down all of that. But at the same time, it's it's not just about breaking them down, but it's actually building something that's more resilient and strengthening the foundations that are out there.
I see Juan and Carla both have the hands up. Juan, I think you were first. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no, just very quickly on kind of the practice-based component. We also convene this initiative called 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People, and it's really based on that. It's really thinking about how to be more effective and how to have much more of a learning community in relation to landscape approaches, understanding that the systemic entry point means that there's a lot of diversity, policy frameworks and economic incentive structures in different places mean that there are very different outcomes, even with similar practices. So really being aware that all of this is really underpinned by adaptive collaborative management at its core, and that will evolve over time. So that even kind of like the different governance structures that are effective in different times and different political points may need to change to be resilient, as Sunita was saying. And it's really important to recognize that the more formalized structures may not always exist in their same form, because the resilience is really found in kind of the more bottom-up participatory process rather than just kind of like the national level and top-down dialogues, even if those are necessary. Really trying to find those interlinkages over time is kind of what we found to be kind of at the core. And of course, the national level process is essential to providing better enabling conditions, providing better opportunities for mobilizing resources, but really kind of like the work at the core of the bottom-up process is really where things happen.
Hello?
Yeah, maybe just to add up in the discussion. So I totally agree with what has been said by Juan and Sunita. No, so while we're actually a regional organization, we do tend to also have initiatives working on the ground. And I think the stories that we share for the most part is actually those stories on the ground. So in line from what has been discussed, we have initiatives also, what we call the biodiversity-based products. So these are products that actually we've supported local communities in in particular protected areas or on the buffer zones of it. No? So yeah, so we've supported cooperatives working on their honey production, their tea production as well. So these products basically you would retain these systems, no? So without resorting to deforestation. So yeah, and we've also seen some of our beneficiaries grow as well in the process, no? And they've had bigger voices already, no? In the bigger arena. And of course, aside from their respective products that have already grown in proportion, no? And yeah, but yeah.
Right, thank you very much, Colonel. I'll jump onto a separate question. We've just got about 10 minutes left, and there are a couple of bits and pieces I'd like to pick up from contributions here. I think we'll be able to get through all of them. One of them is from Muhammad Yusuf Ayubi. He was asking, what are the experts' roles in determining environmental sustainability goals? And I think Muhammad, what you're talking about, you answered a follow-up question of mine. I asked you to be more specific, and I think you mentioned policymakers or decision makers. Just very quickly here, and this is kind of stepping back a little bit from the more focused discussion, but it is relevant because of the relevance of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, where the parties negotiate text like the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, policymakers representing the different countries take part in this process. So those are policymakers, very often with scientific advisors sitting behind them. But then the CBD also has a body called SBSTA, a subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. And this is a body that convenes the same group of countries that convenes in between the COPs, which is specifically trying to gather scientific advice. And then on top of that, there's IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And all these acronyms and names must be bewildering to those who haven't heard them before. But IPBES is the other really important organization in the context of biodiversity, much newer than the CBD. They've been around since 2012, so just over 10 years now. But IPBES's main function is to assess biodiversity. So they've produced several multinational assessments, or either global or regional assessments of biodiversity. And that information is a collection of information from around the world, which also feeds into these processes. So there are experts that make up all of the assessment teams that produce all this information. And then there are also these experts who sit behind the policymakers, or who join the policymakers, or who attend instead of the policymakers these forums of the CBD. So I hope that's a decent answer for you. It's, as I mentioned, a little bit removed from the landscape approaches focus that we have here, but very relevant at that sort of higher level where these decisions come from in the first place. So I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to add to that. It's a little bit of a topic change, but if I don't see any hands, I'll look for the next question. Sunita, please go ahead while I scroll
No,
through.
I have a question for
Yeah.
Carlo, and that's because I'm aware of all the intense work you do on mainstreaming biodiversity across multiple sectors within the ASEAN region. You know, there's so much effort that you put in. And I was wondering, because the landscape approach is it's whole of society, but in a way it tries. I mean, it because at the landscape level, the sectoral priorities are all enmeshed, and so it's like in practice, mainstreaming has to occur, or it's I mean, just for realistic purposes. But how would you, maybe it's the question would be, how has been your experience so far in getting other sectors to embrace? I know it's tricky, but still, yeah, you know, it's an idea, because when we are talking about all of these that we have to work together, get others to do stuff that we want them to do, it's easier said than done, and be nice to get your thoughts on how this actually works out.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge, you know. But yeah, I suppose just to start with, in terms of what we're working on. So I guess the best entry point on where we are is to reach out within the auspices of the ASEAN. So in the ASEAN, there are different sectors working, so we have on one part, we have the one pillar on the economic, sociocultural community, where the environment is at, and where biodiversity is at as well. So at least working on that pillar, it's quite easier because it's easier to navigate, at least in our network of the ASEAN. But still, there are definitely challenges that we do encounter, because at least in terms of the ASEAN, if that is not in their respective action plan, that won't be their priority. So I guess this time is actually the perfect time to develop. So we already have the mainstreaming frameworks in place. that we just need now to communicate to the different sectors that we would like to reach out to: agriculture, fisheries, tourism, health. Health is getting traction because it's it's a priority of the ASEAN. No? But the other sectors that may tend to lag behind, we need to work up further, no? But I guess given that the ASEAN is in that process of revisiting their vision, and consequently they will also have to revisit their respective action plans. So, and I think we're already ahead, no, in terms of the plan for biodiversity, and it's really just a matter of communicating this, no, to the different sectors. So it's really quite entrenched, no, but yeah, we're definitely leading somewhere.
Catherine, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just very, very short. I think also relating to that could be the fact that the donor landscape is also shifting. I know most of our organizations, we are responding to these calls from donors. And also from what I'm increasingly seeing in the region, so for example, East Africa region also, is the calls that are being made are actually encouraging us to adopt a landscape approach. So, you know, as we are responding to the calls, and this also means integrating across sectors. So, for some, you need to bring in the issue of climate change. You need to bring in the issue of health. You need to demonstrate how your project or program is going to really address all these other perspectives. We're talking about indigenous people. Yeah. So I think the fact that, you know, from the donor perspective, also now there's kind of this, you know, is it a push, you know? So we are also taking on that approach. So I hope that addresses that question. Yeah.
I think my perception is that there's really more support for environmental issues now than there has ever been. And that's kind of led by climate change, but I think that biodiversity is kind of, you know, benefiting to some extent from that focus on climate change. And I guess our job is to, or part of our job is to increase that share of the focus. Juan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, just on this, I think it's COP28 was also very interesting because of the discussions on integration. I think it's the first time that food systems, for example, was also included there. And I think that for the biodiversity community, thinking really seriously about food systems in relationship to biodiversity and climate is a huge challenge. But it's also a great opportunity because I think this is where most of the real economic incentives and subsidies are from a policy perspective, and how to integrate different indicators and decision-making data for governments is a really key opportunity, because food systems are also kind of in the process of integration to NDCs, or at least they're trying to. All of that is incredibly difficult, and no one really, I think, knows how to do it very well. But biodiversity underpins the real resiliency and sustainability of all of these things at their core. So being able to highlight that with different actors and move in that integration, I think, has a lot of opportunities for biodiversity proponents.
Right. We have 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to quickly pick up on two quick comments. So one is just Oliver has also just mentioned the COP that's coming up in Cali in Colombia toward the end of this year. So you can have a look at that in the comments. I recommend that anyone who's interested in these topics, especially if they happen to be in the area, attend that conference, although it is far away for most of us. But then also there was a specific question, Sunita, from Kumaraguru, about whether there's a ongoing biodiversity assessment in India. I don't know if I'm a little bit out of touch with that. I know that they produce MBSAPs, but I'm not sure about biodiversity assessments. Do you have any idea?
I don't think there is a nationwide assessment that's being done, but of course there are initiatives, there are project initiatives where such assessments are there, but they are like more how shall I say, anecdotal or episodic. So it's not like a coordinated assessment of landscapes, but it is definitely something. There is political. So the negotiators, at least the delegation from India, definitely is supportive of this idea. of advancing landscape approaches. Yeah, however it is being played out in other national plans, but in official negotiations, that's the position that I've seen.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's also, perhaps not in direct answer to that, but there's also the regional assessment for Asia and the Pacific that IPBES published now 4, 5 or 6 years ago. So it's still getting a little bit old now, but which does, it has sort of several graphics which include the different subregions and sometimes the countries as well. So you might want to check that out. And then there are an increasing number of countries which are following the IPBES example at the national level, but so far just a handful of them. Okay, I think we better stop there. It's exactly 9:30 here in Japan. Just want to say a huge thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you so much for your information and your thoughts and your all the contributions that you've had to make, and also to the audience. You've been really active. I'm sorry if we didn't get around to every single one of the questions, but I think probably there was an answer, a little bit of an answer for each of you. So thank you very much for attending. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your morning, your afternoon, or your evening. Bye-bye, everybody.
And then there's the YouTube link, right? Andre, you forgot to mention that if people want to have a look.
Right. So we will put this on YouTube. We need to decide which platform that would be sort of linked to, Sunita, right? So we don't have one yet, as far as I know. I think, do you think that it'll be on the UNU-IAS YouTube channel?
I think we could. I think we could. We need to check with communications people, but we should be able to.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you once again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.